Thank you so much for some rather too generous words of introduction. It is, needless to say, a very great pleasure and an honour to be in Hong Kong, back here in Hong Kong. I lived here for 11 years in the 80s and early 90s, and thereafter found myself coming back here about every 2 months for something like 20 years. I have less specific reason to be doing that these days, but I like to think that I can do it at least once a year, and it's always a pleasure to be back. The Dean opened his remarks with some Cantonese. He was very brave. I'm not even going to try that. If it's difficult for him, it's close to impossible for me, although I have to say that I invested a long time ago quite a number of hours, a large number of hours in trying to learn Cantonese. And I think I got as far as being able to direct a taxi and order a glass of beer, but not much further than that. So there we go. So I'll deliver my lecture in English, if I may. And I chose the title, or Fred and I discussed a title, and I chose a title that is slightly complicated. And then I read some of the titles of the lectures from speakers in earlier years, and I realised mine is quite a short title compared with some of those. But I wanted to talk about shifting geopolitics and rising risk, because I think there's some interesting things to be said under that heading. To the extent that these are harbingers of some kind of financial crisis, I've got a few thoughts on that, but I'm going to major mainly on why I think the shifting geopolitics are critical for us. And I'm going to try and delve a little deeper and a little more historically than we perhaps normally do when we talk about the great shift of the centre of gravity from west to east, which is becoming something of a cliche these days. Mind you, it's a cliche because it's true, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the implications of it and some of the background to it. So here goes. And I start with what may seem to be a slightly odd starting point, but on November the 2nd, i.e. less than a month ago, the United Nations passed a resolution, the General Assembly passed a resolution. It was about preventing an arms race in space. And it ends up with the following: practical measures to be examined and taken in the search for an agreement to prevent an arms race in outer space in a common effort towards a community of shared future for humankind. That's a slightly odd phrase at the end of it. It was barely noticed in any of the, certainly the international Western media. But Beijing noticed it. And they noticed it for the following reason. It's probably the shape of some things to come. It's one of the two officially approved, or officially used anyway, English translations of a phrase that is now a central part of Xi Jinping thought. The other version of it is a community of common destiny. And as one of the central elements of Xi Jinping thought, it's probably an early, perhaps even the earliest example of that thought becoming part of the rhetoric, the administrative language, if you will, of the United Nations, the shape of things to come, possibly. And I want to dwell on this for a bit. First of all, by looking a bit more at some of the key elements of Xi Jinping thought. This may seem to be a rather bold thing for a Londoner to do, but there are two related, separable but related spheres of human activity on which that thought concentrates. One of them primarily domestic, of course, and one of them primarily international. It's as if it focuses inwards and outwards in a related way. On the domestic front, as everybody knows, the watchword is socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Only the last bit of that is, of course, new. The phrase itself, socialism with Chinese characteristics, goes back to Deng Xiaoping, who championed that phrase. He himself didn't invent it, but he championed that phrase more than 30 years ago now. And the interesting thing about that phrase is that it's a deft way of continuing to honour Marxist metaphysics, if I can put it that way, despite the obvious incompatibility of those metaphysics with the China of either the 20th, let alone the 21st century, and allowing the reform and opening which he drove forward to proceed and still be termed as part of the socialist journey. They had articulated a view that there were phases to the Marxist journey towards full-blooded socialism, and that China was in the first phase. Some of the literature talks about 3 phases, some of the literature talks about 4 phases, but the important point was that China was in the first phase, and that first phase was expected to last well over 100 years. And therefore, this put off into the very far distant future any greater difficulty of reconciling the Marxist metaphysics and what was going on in reality. So, for example, insofar as the difference between capitalism and socialism had often been characterized as the difference between a planned economy and a market economy, Deng Xiaoping was able to say that, well, capitalists have plans, and there's no reason why socialist systems can't have markets. And then he famously summed all that up with the comment about the colour of the cat. The new bit is the reference to a new era, and even that is not all of it new. In fact, most of it is not new, because the new era refers to a determination after the initial surge of economic activity and explosion of the private sector, rapid transformation, particularly of the East Coast provinces, to the need for a more balanced economy, a more balanced society, to tackle the issues posed by yawning gaps in income equality or inequality, to tackle the fact that a gap had opened up between huge progress on the East Coast and rather less progress in the centre and west. That's not new, that's been with us for several years. Also to focus on the need for a growth path, an economic development path that was strongly innovative rather than relying on the core industries which have been the backbone of early stages, particularly in the state-owned enterprises. And therefore a focus on technological progress, selected sectors where Chinese technological prowess could become world-class and even world-beating. And of course the environmental dimension to this, getting away from rather dirty, older industries that are producing immense amounts of carbon emissions and causing damaging pollution in the cities. None of this is new. What was very reassuring was the renewed emphasis on the need for more international connectivity of the economy, more international participation in both directions, more of an open welcome to inward investment from outside, more of an encouragement to get more connected internationally for Chinese businesses. And Xi Jinping's speech at Davos earlier this year again underscored the importance of this, in, of course, sharp contrast to the noises coming out of the then new American administration. Lastly, and something that is newer, the rule of law. Or, as it's described, and I am quoting them, the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics, which I think in plain English means the rule by law. To draw the contrast that Francis Fukuyama set out in his remarkable book, Political Order and Political Decay, of a couple of years back. The party as supreme arbiter, as the president of the Supreme People's Court, no less, spelt out a few months ago. This is clearly an important theme of Xi Jinping's administration and will be an important characteristic of Chinese economic and social development going forward. And for those who I've heard Westerners say, well, this is just Confucianism, wrong. It's not a Confucian theme. What it is a theme that goes a little bit further back still. It goes back to the way in which the Qin dynasty sought to control and consolidate China. Qin, he of the terracotta warriors, for those who need that pointer. And so there you have the socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, the domestic focus of the new thought. And alongside that, then, you have the international dimension to Xi Jinping thought, which I think is not only newer than any of the themes that come out about domestic policy, but also more strategically significant. To use the phrase that was in the speech to the Party Congress, China would work to build a community of shared future or common destiny, to use the two approved English translations, for all mankind. That phrase is interesting. It's the latest and, I would argue, crucial milestone on a Chinese journey which will affect us all. Deng Xiaoping famously said, China should hide its capacities. It should bide its time. It should be good at maintaining a low profile, and it should never claim leadership. Hu Jintao, in 2012, started to change that. He called for China to take an active part, and again I'm quoting, in international affairs and work to make the international order and system more just and equitable. And he also called for China to, and here's the wording is important, to recognize the community of shared future, common destiny, the same phrase again, insofar as it applied to China's neighborhood. Xi Jinping in 2014 took that a little further and said China should turn its neighborhood into a community of common destiny. And then, come the Party Congress, the crucial extension of this, the community of common destiny for humankind. It is the first time you've heard the Chinese leadership say that. It's Chinese foreign policy going global. And this month's UN resolution, or last month's, we're now the 1st of December, UN resolution that I started by quoting is a sign that that language is beginning to catch on. It is, as an aside, not new. And by the way, not a Chinese invention. Because there was a 19th century French theoretician, Ernest Renan, who wrote a very influential essay at the time, and it's about 1880, I think I'm right in saying, called What is a Nation? He was writing that in order to contest some notions coming out of other parts of Europe, that nation was based on race, language, cultural identity, and he argued that that nation is not that, but a deeply felt sense of community and shared destiny. And he used the phrase, community of common destiny. I don't know whether it's just by chance that one of the approved translations of Xi Jinping's thought on international affairs happens to be that same phrase, or whether somewhere in the Chinese thought process, amongst the thought leaders, somebody has studied Ernest Renan's thought. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true, because in general, the Chinese study European thought much more carefully than Europeans study Chinese thought. But whatever the truth about that is, I think the important point is that we are in a new era which will work itself out in the coming decades. And in state-sponsored academic literature, there's a very clear justification that you can see for the Belt and Road Initiative in these terms. The community of shared destination, I have seen argued, is a community of shared interests and responsibilities. The interests are represented by growing economic interdependence, and the responsibilities by good, friendly political and security relationships. And not just the Belt and Road Initiative, which at the end of the day is largely about neighbourhood, although neighbourhood on a fairly extended basis, admittedly. But this is now being applied explicitly to a whole new global order. And explicitly, furthermore, contrasted to the old mentality which, again, Chinese thought leadership describes as being a zero-sum mentality in international relations, or indeed a Cold War mentality in international relationships, thereby taking a jibe at both the West and the old Soviet Empire. This is radical stuff, it seems to me, and we ignore it at our peril, or think it's not relevant to us at our peril. It's not just about slogans and academic philosophizing. It's not just, although it is, a critique of the post-war international order. It's a whole new approach to international order and governance, and maybe for the first time in history, it's as if the new international order might be thought to need, at least to some extent, to acquire those Chinese characteristics that China refers to when it's talking about socialism and the domestic agenda. And remember, as we think about this, the deep history behind all of this, including remembering the fact that the mandate of heaven was always a mandate for the governance of all under heaven. Remember, too, the long-term focus of all of this. So how does this play out in specifics in the near term? And by the near term, I mean just merely the next 50 years or so. In order to answer that question, I think we have to look backwards a bit. And I want to look backwards to the 19th century, when there was no single global power. There was no international mandate of heaven, if you will, and where the governance of international relationships took the form of what the Europeans came to call the concert of powers. Itself, the development of a European structure of international relationships within Europe that arose out of its religious wars in the 17th century. And by the late 19th century, there were 6 powers that were members of the concert. It was a pretty explicitly defined concert, by the way. It wasn't just a loose grouping. Those 6 powers were Germany, France, Britain, Austria, and Russia and Turkey as the 2 non-European members of the group. It held formal congresses. Indeed, it called itself into being at the Congress of Vienna just after the Battle of Waterloo, which organised the post-Napoleonic settlement of Europe. And there were several minor congresses that followed that. And then there came a period when the British refused to play ball. Does that sound familiar? And it was not until 1878 that there was another Congress, this time in Berlin. In Berlin, because Germany was by that time the new boy on the block and the most powerful economy in Europe, and the British, even the British, found that they had to attend. Anything about the realities of Brexit that sound familiar in this? And the issue was the Balkans, which they tried to sort out, but in the end failed to do so. The system worked so long as there was a rough balance amongst the members, so long as none of the members was expansionist in its ambitions, which was more or less true at the time, and so long as there was no outsider, a rogue state, that had no interest in the status quo and indeed might have thought it had an interest in disturbing the status quo. It allowed the first global capital market to develop. It was a time of massive technological progress, of course. It was a time of huge investment in infrastructure, railways, and it was a time of rapid industrialization. Not so much in Britain, which had already done it by that time, as in Germany, even in Russia. And this was an exciting time in the world's development when there were a lot of people around who were very optimistic about how increased trade and investment connectivity, increased travel was getting to know each other was going to put paid to any risks of geopolitical instability. But the system was inherently vulnerable, and we know what happened. 1914 was not inevitable, but the probability of catastrophe was never as low as the markets thought it was. Then came the 20th century with the great rollback of globalization. The First World War put a stop to the global capital market. And it was actually 3/4 of a century before we managed to put a new global capital market more or less in place. It was, of course, also the point of collapse of the concert of powers itself. 2 of them broke up in 1918, Austria and the Ottoman Turks. 1 of them was ruined and divided in 1945. 2 of them were subsequently dismantled on a more or less peaceful basis, the British and French empires, and 1 broke up in 1989, the Soviet Union. And of course, that period also saw the emergence of the new great power on the block, the United States, the driver and sponsor of the post-war international architecture. You might put it in ancient Chinese terms as the country that inherited, for a brief moment, the international mandate of heaven. But it didn't last. And what we've seen as the 21st century is unfolding is not a strong new international order, so much as the gradual emergence of a new concert of powers. Except that the membership of that concert is, of course, very different. That concert is emerging at a time when there are many parallels in terms of perceptions of economic opportunities and many parallels in terms of vulnerabilities and some new threats to cope with. The new concert of power is, of course, no longer European or Europe-based. Europe itself is now clearly in long-term relative decline, not absolute, but relative decline. It has a cumbersome governance. It is rather self-absorbed, preoccupied with various internal and neighbourhood challenges. The UK thinks that Brexit is the most important of those, but it's not top of the list of either France or Germany. And in general, Europe is unsure these days of its identity and of how it should present itself on the world stage of the 21st century. And in some ways, it is reverting to what it had been before the year of about 1500, when it was one corner of the Eurasian landmass. A large market and a prosperous one for sure, but geopolitically underweight. No, the new concert of powers is plainly Eurasian-based. It's not genuinely global. There's no power from Africa on the world stage. There's no power from Latin America on that world stage, notwithstanding the fact that the famous acronym included Brazil. I wouldn't see that reflecting the geopolitical realities yet. As of now, Eurasia, which is 35% of the world's landmass, but 70% of the world's population and 65% of the world's GNP, as well as being home and origin to all of the world's great cultures, is the new context for the concert of powers. And who are the members of that group? Or at least that group in formation, which is probably a better way of describing it. The US, of course. Some of the commentary in the media tends to assume that the US is a completely busted flush. And of course, Trump, with his daily tweets, gives us the impression that it's lost all substance. This would be a mistake. Don't short America for very long. It's an extraordinary society and an extraordinary economy with a capacity to reinvent itself and a dynamism which is still the envy of the world in many ways. It is also the only geopolitical power engaged at both ends of the Eurasian landmass. And yet the fact is that the move from being the global superpower, the global possessor of the mandate, if you will, which didn't last very long, is proving difficult for America. Loosening the reins of its control over the Bretton Woods institutions is proving hard for it. And this isn't just the Trump administration. This has been his predecessors. It was not Trump who was dismayed and attempted to slow up the creation of the AIIB, for example. There's something deeper and more continuous about the way in which America is showing a less than sure-footed response to the change in the world order. Who else is on the world stage? Well, China, of course. Indeed, China's arrival on the world stage is the great new fact of the 21st century. China will, at some point in the next few years, become the largest economy in the world. It may already be so. I don't think anybody can be precisely sure of when that takes place. But that's just a milestone on a road, since I believe that China will continue to grow quite rapidly for another generation, which will take China to not merely the largest economy in the world, but by far the largest economy in the world. Who else is on the world stage? India, for sure. The country that will soon become the largest by population. Economically, it's got a lot further to go than China has, of course, but it's showing reasonable growth. It has some interesting issues politically. If you read the, I think, really rather interesting leader in today's FT, you will see what I mean about the nature of the weakness of the challenge to Modi at present. And in that rather pointless debate that you sometimes hear about which is the oldest continuous culture in the world, India has a fair claim to be the winner. Indian sacred texts are older by some centuries than anything in either China or Europe. A point that I might have wished that somebody had made to Trump as he was having that rather embarrassing exchange with the Chinese leadership recently about whether in Europe or China was the older continuous civilization. That's an aside. Who else is on that world stage? Japan, a country we perhaps don't talk about enough. It's still the world's third largest economy. It's still one of the most sophisticated economies in the world. It's a country which could nuclearize itself within, what do you want to say, 1 year, 18 months, possibly even less than that. Russia, for all of its difficulties, the fact that it's not at peace and really never has been at ease with any of its neighbours doesn't alter the fact that it's geopolitically significant as the country that bestrides Eurasia, is one of the most richly resource-endowed countries on the planet, is highly educated, and is a nuclear power. And I could go on. What about Iran? What about Turkey? And what, as an aside, about Europe's place on that stage? In all this, I think there are three important things to note. Firstly, the severe limitations of the post-war international governance and order. The UN, which I started with, has proved a very flabby institution on the whole, and maybe it never could have lived up to the hopes that those who brought it into being in 1943 had for it. The Bretton Woods institutions, clearly in need of a reform, at least of their governance, reforms which have by and large been resisted by American administrations and by Congress for a long period of time. The G7, emerging gradually into the G20. One of them is too one-sided, the other is too big to be any meaningful concert of power. And so the governance question at the international level remains open. That's my first point. The second point is that in this context there are huge economic opportunities looking forwards. There are threats, of course. The world trade discussion is not in good health at the moment. And again, if you read the papers this morning, reports of growing difficulties between the US and China, and between China and both the US and the EU. But the fact is that a Chinese commitment expressed through Xi Jinping's speech at Davos to continued and enhanced globalization and the outworking of the Belt Road Initiative, not over the next year or two or three or four, but over the next generation, is going to be something extraordinary. It will take time. And there are plenty of voices around, I know now, who say this is really just lots of hot air with no real substance to it. I don't believe that. It will take time, but it really will transform the world's largest and most populated landmass over a couple of generations. And then thirdly, there are significant and rising risks in all of this. Firstly, there is a rising tide of what can only be described as assertive or even aggressive cultural nationalism in almost every one of the great powers that I've mentioned. And there is also at least one dangerous rogue state around. China itself. I'm not an expert, but and I certainly can't read it directly, but I'm told that if you follow the social media chat, there's a very clear sense, very broadly spread amongst the people of China, that China's time has arrived. One might add from a historical perspective that this is slightly reminiscent of the mood of Germany in the late 19th century. It's as if the party is not so much a Marxist party as it is a motherland party. It cares about the standing and identity and place in the world of China. Westerners who think that the party lacks legitimacy because it is not an elected parliamentary democracy are kidding themselves. Russia, Putin as Tsar, all kinds of dysfunctionality, of course, never at ease with any of its neighbours. And yet, there's one thing to be more nervous about than confronting a bear is to confront a wounded bear. And that is how China felt, that's how Russia felt from the 1990s onwards, and to some extent still feels it. Japan. Abenomics was never just about rekindling the Japanese economy through macroeconomic management. Abenomics is a means to an end, explicitly so, and you saw it very clearly in the recent general election, the end of repealing Article 9 of the Constitution and coming out from under the tutelage that it's been in since 1945. And maybe events on the Korean Peninsula provide it with the perfect context. Modi and Erdogan. I could go on more time than I have available, but what do Modi and Erdogan have in common? For all of their differences, the differences between their two countries and the differences between those two people and the differences between their two systems, what they have in common is that both Modi and Erdogan are seeking to wind up a secularizing inheritance on the basis of which their countries were founded. What Erdogan is doing is attacking the inheritance of Kemal Ataturk, and what Modi is doing is attacking the inheritance of Jawaharlal Nehru. I could go on. Iran, 2,500 years of a rich history which they're intensely proud of. Every taxi driver in Tehran can quote to you some of the great Iranian poets. It's a proud, complex Shiite citadel. It was never just another Muslim country, and it's potentially a nuclear power. And what of Europe? Well, I've commented on Europe's mood at the moment, and I only add to that by noting that the famous jibe that a former American Secretary of State made about the British. The British were people who had lost an empire and not yet found a role. Brexit, I think, proves that that is still true. And I think also that this applies more broadly to the Europeans and not just to the British. The Europeans have not yet really found a role. So I think the risks are there, and I think the geopolitical tensions are there. You never know when something might boil over and become a significant international incident. South China Sea, the Middle East, Korea, of course. India's sense of encirclement by the Belt Road Initiative. We should not underestimate the extent to which India feels threatened by developments to the north of it, the corridor down through Pakistan to Gwadar, the new port on the Persian Gulf, and the potential of a railway from Kunming down to Singapore. How, over the longer term, does India get peacefully and properly integrated into a Eurasian development strategy? A question that I think will gradually become more insistent over time. And in all of this, how will the US-China relationship itself develop? As I've said, it's deeper than just the Trump phenomenon. What is the US commitment here in this part of Eurasia and at the European end of it? It wasn't Trump who started grumbling about the failure of the European nations to pay up properly for the NATO budget. How will the US continue to engage? I don't think the US knows the answer to this. They know they've got a rising problem. They don't know how to deal with it. And finally, and relatively briefly, what are the implications of all this for global markets? Well, the first thing I want to say is that I don't have a view on the short-term movements of the markets. I don't have any better insight than you do on whether the markets are or are not fully valued or overvalued at present. I note the views of some people I respect that say that certain markets are, the UK housing market, for example, possibly the US stock market, that there are debt burdens around and some pools of debt look unsustainable, the Italian banking situation, for example, some Chinese corporate exposures, and all the rest of it. There's ample commentary on the current health of the markets, available. I want just to leave you with a few brief remarks on some longer term perspectives on how markets react to significant geopolitical issues when they blow up. And the first is to note that in the case of July 1914, which came out of the blue, completely out of the blue, the markets had been riding pretty high before that. They were closed for several months at the outbreak of war in basically all of the major markets, including the US, which was not directly involved in the war. They reopened in the autumn at various stages. The US, when it reopened, went sharply down, but then started to recover as people started to notice that some parts of the economy might do quite well out of the war. And Lloyd George, the then British Prime Minister, made a famous comment on the newly elected Parliament after the First World War. He noted how it seemed to be full of people who had done rather well out of the war. Other times in history, Cuba, the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, seem to have had little effect on the markets. And this week, when North Korea lets off its biggest ICBM yet, the markets, both in New York and then here, went up. Not by a lot, and I suspect the truth is not that they liked it, but that they were actually taking no notice of it. I think that points to a degree of uncertainty and a recognition that we know very little about how the markets would behave if something really badly goes really badly wrong. Catastrophe is not priced in, and it's actually hard to see how you can price catastrophe in. Stability, well, certainly there's a lot of regulation that has come in the wake of the financial crisis, of course, and the financial markets are, I suggest, a lot more stable than they were 10 years ago. But there will go on being a management challenge for authorities and for the participants, requiring careful international coordination from time to time. There are some clouds on the horizon, debt ratios, etc. But I see no reason to believe that it's rising in itself for a big fall at the moment. So I want to end where I started. We live in genuinely interesting times. China's arrival on the world stage, with a view of the need for the international order to reflect what it describes as a community of common destiny for humankind, has been made possible by its economic rise, and is surely the most important development on the world stage, certainly since 1989, possibly since 1945, possibly even since 1914. Thank you very much.